Anakin Skywalker, the Chosen One, the boy genius from Tatooine who went from promising young Jedi Knight to Sith Lord. At the heart of this tragic story lies an archetypal truth that affects all of us. Just a quick reminder to like and subscribe as it helps the channel greatly. Now, back to the video. When we first meet Anakin, he is a brilliant and sweet-natured boy, overflowing with potential and intelligence, however trapped and plagued by unfortunate circumstances. This is the first stage of the tragic hero archetype. Carl Jung identified archetypes as universal human experiences. All archetypes exist within our shared unconscious and symbolize psychological traits and processes. The tragic hero archetype always begins with great promise. The first person who identified this promise in Anakin's tale was Qui-Gon Jinn. He observed Anakin's talent and discovered that he was conceived by the Force. Qui-Gon recognized the prophecy in Anakin and realized he was the chosen one destined to bring balance to the Force. However, upon returning to Coruscant, the Jedi Council are immediately wary of Anakin and sense great fear in him. This is the foreshadowing of the fall not only of Anakin, but of the Jedi. You see, the tragic hero archetype plays out across the entire story, not just Anakin's tale. The Jedi consider themselves servants of the Force who are guided by its will. It's curious then that the Jedi reject a boy who was conceived by the Force. For all intents and purposes, Anakin is an embodiment of the Force and its will. Yet the Jedi deny him. The Jedi doctrine is clear about the dangers of the dark side, and they sense this in Anakin. Jung often talked about the shadow, which is essentially all that which is feared and repressed within the psyche. It is buried within the unconscious of an individual and collective. The dark side, in essence, can be understood symbolically as the shadow. Despite the Council's denial, Anakin is trained nonetheless by Obi-Wan Kenobi, who gave his word to Qui-Gon before his death. Anakin quickly develops and shows extraordinary Jedi ability. However, Anakin is noticeably troubled. He has both great fear of loss surrounding his mother and Padme, and struggles with anger at feeling held back and undervalued by the Jedi. Therefore, Anakin is essentially struggling greatly with his shadow, and doesn't know how to deal with it. He finds himself frequently overwhelmed by it. In the tragic hero archetype, this is what's known as the hamartia, which translates to the tragic flaw or mistake. Anakin is overwhelmed by his feelings of anger and fear. In fact, in the Attack of the Clones, we see his fears and anger come to life with the death of his mother and him slaughtering those who killed her. However, the fatal flaw in the tragic hero archetype isn't just demonstrated by Anakin's struggle with his shadow, but the Jedi's blindness to the shadow. If we look at the larger story, the Jedi are unaware that the Sith Lord Darth Sidious has been operating right alongside them as Chancellor. While they feel some concerns around Palpatine and his emergency powers within the Republic, they do not realize he is actually the Sith Lord. A concerning fact considering they are servants of the Force and yet are unable to detect such a powerful and dark presence of the Force in their midst. But from a Jungian perspective, this makes perfect sense. You see, the shadow, as mentioned earlier, is the repressed and denied part of the psyche. Jung talked about the integration of the shadow as being an essential part of psychological maturation and wellness. Therefore, the Jedi's complete rejection of it not only leaves them blind to it festering within the Republic, but it also leaves them unable to really help Anakin in his struggle with it. In fact, Qui-Gon, who found and believed in Anakin, appeared to have a more nuanced and holistic understanding of the Force than most Jedi. This was demonstrated as he was no stranger to disagreeing with the Council, and depended heavily on what he felt within the Force instead of the more dogmatic approach of the Council. Symbolically, therefore, it appears that Qui-Gon had successfully integrated more of his shadow, and was more balanced, which begs the question, had he survived, would he have actually been able to help Anakin through his struggles, stopping the fall to the dark side? Sadly, however, Qui-Gon wasn't able to guide Anakin, so Anakin is left in a precarious position. You see, Anakin, while loved greatly by Obi-Wan, is still not fully trusted by the Jedi Council, and is largely left alone in his struggles with fear and anger. Lord Sidious, posing as the Chancellor, sees this along with Anakin's powerful potential and takes full advantage, becoming a mentor figure to Anakin. Lord Sidious can be understood as the collective shadow that is festering within the Republic. The Jedi's rejection of the shadow leaves it buried in the unconscious of the collective, which allows it to grow unseen. Anakin is caught between the Jedi Council and the Chancellor. The fact that Anakin is already struggling with his own shadow, which has no place within his Jedi life and community, leaves him susceptible to being drawn in by the growing collective shadow. When the shadow is not integrated, it runs the risk of spreading within the unconscious and then exerting destructive influence over the individual. The ego structure is the known personality of an individual. It's what they consciously understand about themselves. The shadow, therefore, must be integrated into the ego structure. The purpose of integrating it is to bring whatever is feared and repressed within the psyche into consciousness. This brings it under conscious control and leads to a fuller, more balanced individual. The danger of an unintegrated shadow is exactly what plays out with Anakin. His fears are manipulated by Lord Sidious, most notably his fear of losing Padme. Anakin is having visions of Padme's death, and Sidious uses this moment to tell Anakin that he can learn the power to stop others from dying. This leads to Anakin turning against the Jedi and committing himself to Lord Sidious. In essence, he is consumed by the shadow. This is the stage of the tragic hero archetype known as peripetia, which essentially means the reversal of fortune and is usually connected to the fatal flaw. Anakin's fall from grace and submitting to Lord Sidious is the tragedy of the tale, along with the fall of the Republic and the Jedi Order. Obi-Wan and Yoda discover what has transpired, and yet they are unable to stop it. Obi-Wan can't save Anakin in his descent into the dark side, and seems to acknowledge this when he states, "I have failed you, Anakin." This is also true of Yoda and his inability to defeat Lord Sidious. This is the stage of the archetype known as anagnorisis, which in essence is a moment of clarity and insight about the fatal flaw, but an inability to stop it. This stage is followed by nemesis, which translates as the inevitable downfall. Anakin and the Republic are now on a path to destruction, and it cannot be stopped. Once Anakin loses Padme, he has lost to Darth Vader, the Shadow. This is a powerful warning of the destructive consequences of a divided psyche and a divided collective. It is tragic to watch Anakin's fall from grace, particularly in the final moments witnessing Obi-Wan's grief over his lost brother. Obi-Wan says, "You were the chosen one. It was said that you would destroy the Sith, not join them. Bring balance to the Force, not leave it in darkness. You were my brother, Anakin. I loved you." A devastating moment, however also revealing. It further demonstrates a blind spot of the Jedi. The assumption was that balance would be exclusively the destruction of the Sith. In fact, Yoda seems to realize this when he says, "A prophecy that misread could have been." However, if we follow Anakin's story to the very end, he actually does fulfill the prophecy. In his final moments, he sacrifices himself to protect his son Luke and kill the Emperor, Lord Sidious. This brings us to the final stages of the archetype, catharsis and meaning. The catharsis is the hero meeting his fate, which involves an emotional release. Looking at Anakin's tale, how far he fell as well as his final redemption and the fulfillment of the prophecy, evokes feelings of both great sadness and relief. Perhaps the most important stage of the tragic hero archetype, however, is the final one, meaning. So what is the meaning of Anakin's story? Well, from a Jungian perspective, bringing balance to the Force aligns with bringing balance to the psyche, to end the division between the conscious and unconscious. With this in mind, it's curious that Anakin brings an end to both the Jedi and the Sith. The Jedi assumed that bringing balance to the Force meant destroying the Sith only. However, if we look at the Jedi and Sith symbolically, the Jedi represent the light of consciousness and the Sith the feared and unintegrated shadow. From this perspective of psychological development, one doesn't destroy the shadow, they integrate it. They bring it into the light of consciousness and stop it from growing and dominating the individual from the unconscious. From the point of view of psychological development, the Jedi doctrine can be understood as being too rigid. They believed they had to shut out the shadow completely. Yet it was this very approach that allowed it to grow unseen for as long as it did. If Anakin is an embodiment of the Force and was sent by the Force in order to restore balance, in a real sense how his arc unfolded was actually a reflection of the divided state of the collective. The Jedi and the Sith were both extreme opposites. The extremity of this polarization, psychologically speaking, is unsustainable, and so both the Jedi and Sith had to fall in order to restore balance. In fact, no one from the Jedi was able to defeat Lord Sidious except Anakin. This could be understood as a testament to Anakin's ability to eventually understand the shadow and integrate it. Despite Anakin having lost himself to the dark side for so long, Luke wakes up Anakin's old self. In other words, the ego structure that had been totally overwhelmed and overridden by the shadow re-emerges and regains control. In essence, the shadow has been integrated. It was this integration that allowed him to confront and overcome the collective shadow in the form of the Emperor, which had grown from the unaddressed darker aspects of the Republic, becoming a destructive force in the galaxy. Thus, Anakin brought an end to the splitting and the division between the light and the dark, the conscious and unconscious, which restores peace within himself and the collective. A profound story which stands the test of time, in my opinion, because of the degree to which it reflects an eternal truth about human nature and the process of psychological development. You've been watching Archetypal Wisdom. Remember to like and subscribe. Stay wise.